Okay, welcome everyone to another Green Sabbath gathering, our first in 2024, with a special guest, philosopher Kate Soper. And Kate has done a lot of very interesting work, has written a number of books pointing to new ways of doing things. Her most recent book is called Post-Growth Living for an Alternative Hedonism with Verso, if I remember correctly. And she has been a professor at London Metropolitan University and has been long involved with the journal Radical Philosophy, and also was a regular columnist for the journal Capitalism, Nature, Socialism. She has translated a number of works, including works by Sebastiano Timpanaro, Michel Foucault, Cornelius Castoriadis, I always have trouble with his name, and Carlo Ginzburg. And then she's written a number of other books, including What is Nature, Culture, Politics, and the Non-Human. So we are in very good company with Kate, and we are really delighted and honored to have you with us. I will give you the floor now, the proverbial floor, and then we will join in for questions and comments a little later. All right, Kate, go for it.
Yes, very much so. Thank you. And thanks for having me, and welcome to everybody. And I think we can treat this as fairly informal. So I'm going to read a sort of paper, a brief paper, but if you want to kind of interrupt and come back at any point, I think we could do that, and break off and take up the questions at that point.
So should we share your slides again, or you will do that?
Yes, let's have your slides. Do I have to go back to share?
Yeah, so you have to do it, yes.
Yeah, okay. Here they are. Okay, can you see them now?
Yes, perfect.
Got them now, okay. Distinctive to our times is the degree and extent of the alarm being felt over climate change and the sixth extinction. It's diffused among all sectors of society now, and the attention it now commands among all mainstream political parties. This is a big change from 20 years ago, if we think about it. But while the concern may be universal, it's experienced and expressed in diverse ways. And though it may relate to a set of issues affecting the planet as a whole, nations have had very differing roles in the creation of the crisis, and its impacts are likewise at present very differently distributed. Hence the high level of abstraction at which it often gets discussed. The scientists, reasonably enough perhaps, refer us to a generalized anthropogenic role in the crisis and address their warnings to humanity as such. And it's at a similar level of abstraction that many politicians prefer to stay when offering their messages on climate change. But what that abstraction conceals are the massive iniquities of the situation, where wait a minute, I need to move my slides. Do you know why I'm not moving my slides?
No, but you should be able to just know the arrow doesn't work when you on your own keyboard.
That's funny. I've not had this problem before.
Maybe you didn't open the slide. There you go. Yeah, yeah.
I can do it with my yeah, as long as I do it with my mouse, it seems to be okay.
Okay, good.
Yeah, all right. So there you have some stats on this issue that I'm going to talk about here briefly. because what the abstraction conceals are the massive iniquities of a situation where 10% of the world's richest produce half of carbon emissions, while the poorest 3.5 billion account for just a tenth. Where if that wealthiest 10% reduce their emissions to only the EU average, total global emissions would fall by 35%. Where the 50 wealthiest Americans now control as much wealth as the 164 million poorest, and we're ending global poverty for the 21% of those living on less than $1.25 a day would cost just 0.2 of world income, and where the gap between the wealthiest and poorest is ever growing. In 2021, for example, the ultra-rich captured almost 2/3 of all the world's new wealth. Their share of national income in the UK has almost doubled since 1980, while in the US, it's now higher than it was in 1820. What also gets obscured through the abstract treatment is history. The grandiose focus on interactions between the human species and the Earth system gives comfort to a minority of the planet's population, but it obscures the role of the capitalist profit and growth dependent economy in creating the crisis, and it tends to favor the technocratic managerialism of the so-called experts in climate science, while overlooking the long history of knowledge and activism in civil society, both past and present. As the historians of the environmental movement, Benoit and Fressoff, have put it, sorry, I've got to do this manually. When we consider the multiform and general character of environmentalist oppositions and the intensity of environmental reflexivity through time, the major historical problem seems to be not that of explaining the emergence of a new so-called environmental awareness, but rather to understand how those struggles and warnings could have been kept to the margins by industrialist and progressive elites before being largely forgotten, so that it can be claimed that the discovery that we are living in the Anthropocene is only very recent. Affluent governments, meanwhile, with significant support from their electorates and economic advisors, continue to insist they can tackle the environmental problems via green growth measures that integrate with, rather than transform, the existing socio-economic order. But the commitment to the growth model of the economy must now be challenged, even if, as the journalist George Monbiot has suggested, it is secular blasphemy to do so. To quote him on this more fully, we have no hope of emerging from this full spectrum crisis unless we dramatically reduce economic activity. Wealth must be redistributed. A constrained world cannot afford the rich, but it must also be reduced. Sustaining our life support system means doing less of almost everything. Monbiot is largely right, although I think more precision is needed here about what we understand by degrowing the economy, since that project will itself depend in the short term on expanding activity in certain key areas, such as renewable energy, housing provision, education, caring services, and so on, particularly for those in the more impoverished sectors of the globe. What I think matters is how we conceive of that transitional growth. Do we view it as needed forms of productive expansion within an economic system that is being redesigned in order to foster ways of living and ideas of prosperity very different from those of profit-driven capitalist consumer culture? Or are we viewing growth as an essential and permanent dynamic of any effective economic order, and thus as both compatible with environmental conservation and enduringly sustainable? If we're taking the latter view, then in my opinion, it certainly needs rejecting. More efficient technologies have always, in fact, gone together with an overall expansion in resource use and commodities. Since 1975, American energy consumed per dollar of GDP has been cut by half, but energy demand has increased by 40%. In aviation, likewise, fuel efficiency has increased by 40%, but total fuel use increased by 150%. In the EU, emissions were indeed decoupled from growth between 1990 and 2012, but only at a rate of 1%, which is only a quarter of that needed to reach the European Commission's roadmap aim to reduce emissions to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. On this, you can see the decoupling debunked report of 2019 from the European Environmental Bureau, and a similarly damning verdict in the same year from the European Environmental Agency. Such decoupling as has been achieved in affluent nations is also in part due to reliance on emission-intensive imports from China, Vietnam, and elsewhere. So it's not really those like myself who support the degrowth transition who have to prove the wisdom of their case, but those committed to a long-term decoupling project for which to date there is actually no evidence. Even when it's accepted that affluent societies can't continue in their rapacious ways, it's often with regret, with a kind of sense that the more austere consumption required of us will be to our disadvantage. And that kind of consensus, I think, holds across the left-right political divide. There's a sort of agreement here, I think, that we must, as far as possible, preserve the affluent consumerist style of life, and that any restraint on that would mean a loss of enjoyment. Among right-wing politicians, this conviction has led to calls for net zero to be deferred or abandoned because getting there will be too painful. This is particularly true in the UK at the moment. This is Sunak's line, for example. Left of centre politicians, on the other hand, meanwhile, understandably, but implausibly, look to technological innovation to allow us to go on with our customary lifestyle. In other words, to turn up the air conditioning when it gets hot, to buy as many cheap air flights and cars as we choose, to consume as lavishly as we can afford. Renewed and accelerated economic growth, partly engendered by the expansion of green production, for instance, of electric cars, will supposedly ensure that everybody is getting better off, so nobody will mind if the richest 1% continue to own almost half the world's wealth. And all of us, let us not forget, all of this consumption will require massive increase in the availability of green energy. And a lot of experts now are doubting whether we can really come up with that, because it's obviously got to be renewable energy. And there's also the enormous problem of electronic waste that is likely to be involved. Here's some images of the kind of salvage capitalism, as it's sometimes called, that's going on at the moment, with very young children involved in the clearing up process. My alternative, what I call my alternative hedonist argument, which is really I'm claiming here, let's take a look at whether it really is the case that we can't live better if we live in a more sustainable way. So by contrast, this is premised on the idea that even if the work and spend lifestyle were indefinitely sustainable, it wouldn't necessarily enhance human happiness and well-being. beyond a certain point that's already been reached by many. So I believe it's mistaken to present changes in our ways of living and working as if they are essential, only as means to avoid ecological disaster, rather than as desirable in themselves. A sustainable ethic and politics should appeal not only to altruistic compassion and environmental concern, not only to a sense of duty, but also to the more self-regarding gratifications of consuming differently. And to my mind, the whole discourse of climate change and the role of the so-called Anthropocene in its creation gets in the way here and obscures the real target of critique, which is the growth-driven orchestration of ourselves and nature. My alternative hedonist politics of prosperity views our so-called good life as not just environmentally disastrous, but also in many respects undermining well-being rather than promoting it. It is, if you think of it, after all, a major cause of stress and ill health. It subjects us to high levels of noise and stench and generates vast amounts of junk. Its work routines and commercial priorities mean that many people, for much of their lives, begin their days in traffic jams or overcrowded trains and buses, and then spend much of the rest of them glued to the computer screen, often engaged in quite mind-numbing tasks. A good part of this productive activity locks time into the creation of a material culture of ever faster production turnovers and built-in obsolescence, which preempts more worthy, enduring, or interesting forms of human fulfillment. So I think it's hardly surprising that some people, even in the more affluent areas, are now beginning to regret what's been lost in the pursuit of the dominant model of prosperity. And implicit in contemporary laments over lost spaces and communities, the commercial battening on children, the vocational dumbing down of education, the ravages of development, the cloning of our cities and so forth, is a hankering for a society no longer subordinate to the imperatives of growth and consumerist expansion. It's diffuse and it's politically unfocused at the present time, but I think it speaks to a quite widely felt sense of the opportunities that have been squandered in recent decades for creating a fairer, a less harassed, a less environmentally destructive, and, to my mind, more enjoyable way of life. And to defend the progressive dimension of this kind of yearning, which I sometimes refer to as avant-garde nostalgia, in doing that, I think you're not recommending a more ascetic existence. On the contrary, it's to highlight the more puritanical and irrational aspects of contemporary consumer culture. It's to speak for the forms of pleasure and happiness that people might be able to enjoy were they to opt for an alternative economic order. And it's to open up a new political imaginary, a more seductive vision of alternatives to resource-intensive consumption, centered on the reduction of the working week and a slower pace of living. By working and producing less, we could improve health and well-being and provide for forms of conviviality which our harried and insulated travel and work routines make impossible at present. And a cultural revolution along those lines would challenge the advertisers' monopoly on the depiction of prosperity and the good life. It would make the stuff that is now seriously messing up the planet, more cars, more planes, more roads, more throwaway commodities and so on, would make that look ugly because of the energy it squanders and the environmental damage it causes. So you would have a sort of revision of thinking around the aesthetic of material culture. My alternative hedonist approach is therefore challenging all those who would, as it were, naturalize the consumerist way of living, otherwise treat it as if it were unchangeable and essential. And where I differ from people like George Monbiot and others sounding the knell for the planet is in seeing the crisis not just as a disaster looming, but as an opportunity for breaking with many of the currently unpleasurable aspects of affluent ways of working and consuming. My argument also points to what people are beginning to experience themselves about the anti or counter consumerist aspects of their own needs and preferences, and it draws out their implications for the consolidation of a broader and more systemic opposition to the existing order. I've claimed some legitimacy for this approach by reference to what I term, following Raymond Williams, is an emerging structure of feeling. In the emergence, that is, of an incipient critique of consumer culture and support for other greener and more pleasurable ways of living. I mean, it's a kind of latent form of aspiration. Here's the quote from Raymond Williams' Marxism and Literature. The emergent or pre-emergent responses or qualitative changes of affect that don't have to await definition or rationalization before they exert palpable pressures and set effective limits on experience and on action. And I think it's important to note here that in appealing what I think to a more latent aspiration to a different way of living that people are themselves, not all of them obviously, but a lot, maybe already experiencing. My aim is to avoid a sort of moralizing position. It's the appealing to an already existing, if relatively latent, disaffection with the shopping mall culture. So that alternative hedonism is a form of what's sometimes by philosophers called an immanent critique. It's come out of the process of what it is critiquing. And I'm not imputing feelings to people, but seeking to respond to those that are already, in some sense, buried within them and emergent. So overall, the point I'm trying to make here is that climate change may indeed threaten existing habits, but it can also encourage us to envisage and adopt more environmentally benign and personally gratifying habits and practices. And in arguing this, I recognize that, I mean, I've suggested that part of this would be to reduce the amount of work we do, but I recognize that we can't get rid of all unpleasant parts. But I think we could organize work in ways that meant that people didn't spend all their days doing it. I think people want to work, provided it doesn't take over their entire lives and comes with more fulfillment and less stress. Hence my suggestion that we might reinstate some earlier ways of doing and making, enjoy, if you like, more hybrid modes. I mean, we are, if you think about it, in a very fortunate position. We can make use of the smartest technologies that we have in areas such as renewable energy and medicine, but we could also bring back in some areas pleasanter measures of working from the past, craft and artisanal production in some areas. And that would allow for more enriched ways of working and more attractive and durable goods. As the American economist, who some of you may know of, called Juliet Shaw, has put it in her book, Plenitude. We are circling back, and plenitude is a synthesis of the pre and postmodern. From the former, it borrows the vision of skilled artisans producing for their own use, as well as for the market. From the postmodern period comes advanced technology and smart, ecologically parsimonious design. It's the perfect synthesis. Technology obviates the arduous and backbreaking labor of the pre-industrial. Artisan labor avoids the alienation of the modern factory and office. I think it's very true, however, that any moves towards that kind of reorganization of work would need funding in the form of some kind of citizens' income or universal basic income, UBI as it's usually referred to. And there are undeniable problems in providing funds for having more free time. But I think it would be a progressive move to confront and seek to work out some of those problems. I think André Gorz, the seminal French thinker in this area, has made the point that we shouldn't think of UBI as a substitute for welfare payments, but as part of an institutional arrangement needed, as he put it, I quote him here, to wrest life away from the commercial imaginary and total employment model. And it's in the spirit of that objective that I've called for a reconceptualization of progress that has affinities with earlier romantic antithesis to modernity, but which avoids the Puritanism and social conservatism around issues like gender or sexuality associated with traditionalist cultures of resistance. I think we want a conception of prosperity that rejects endless growth as automatically ideal, while also resisting cultural regression. Nations whose citizens' consumption grossly exceeds the planet's carrying capacity can no longer be held out as aspirational models for the rest of the world. And those societies with less industrialized, but more sustainable methods of production and modes of consuming might now begin to count as more progressive, at least in certain respects, and to reposition themselves and to be perceived as more in the vanguard by comparison with what has sometimes been called the overdevelopment of the imperial powers or metropolitan centres, which have rendered them marginal and pre-modern. And it's that reversal that's registered, at least implicitly, in the words of Nemonto Nenquima, who is the co-founder of the indigenous non-profit organization Tiba Alliance and the first female president of the Waorani organization in the Ecuadorian Amazon. She makes the point, you forced your civilization upon us, and now look where we are. Global pandemic, climate crisis, species extinction, and driving it all, widespread spiritual poverty. In all these years of taking from our lands, you have not had the courage or the curiosity or the respect to get to know us, to understand how we see and think and feel, and what we know about life on this earth. So that really is where I've kind of you know, that sort of sums up in a way as a bit of a digest of my position around alternative hedonism. I have suggested that that I'm appealing to an already existing, if latent, body of support for the position. But I certainly don't want, this would be my last point or two here, I don't want to overstate the level of support. It's clear that there's extensive disaffection with work, and there's permanent job insecurity in the so-called precariat, and so on. But despite the growing numbers of disenchanted consumers, I think there's no way in which we can analyze environmental trouble as entirely accountable to the providing industries and their employment strategies or merchandising manipulations. I think there's no question that the appetite and priority given to convenience of many customers in the richer nations and the influence exercise play a major role in it too. And I think any advocacy of transition to a fairer and greener economic order is going to have to recognize that. For example, that Elon Musk is one of the richest on the planet is in part due to the very extensive and continuing support for a car culture that even when electrified is likely to prove unsustainable. That Jeff Bezos is likewise amassing his millions is due to the countless purchasing decisions of those who have so readily colluded in the maintenance of Amazon's gigantic fulfillment centers. You've got some images of them here. So it may well be felt that I'm guilty of too much optimism in thinking one can build an effective countering movement. It will be interesting to hear views on that. I myself would certainly be the first to admit that the argument's questionable on those grounds. But I'm hoping that by supplying a broader cultural dimension to the existing arguments and outlook of the political wing of anti-systemic forces, alternative hedonism could help to inspire a more diverse and substantial opposition to prevailing economic orthodoxy. And I also hope it can provide an overarching imaginary for the various initiatives seeking to bypass mainstream market provision via alternative networks for sharing and recycling and exchanging goods and services and expertise. In other words, what's sometimes called the collaborative or connected consumption. Here's another image of I've lost friends, social connection, all this. One alternative here is the emergence of collaborative consumption, which are bypassing the market provision and based on recycling and sharing and so on. And they've certainly proved valuable in cutting down, acting as a check on the individualization of consumption and allowing us a more collective use of goods and forms of transport and so on. Overall, and this is my last point here, I think, I would argue that the alternative hedonist project has been driven by my sense of the urgency with which we now need to summon a new consciousness of reality. Globally now, I would say, we need to look to other sources to shape our thinking, whether it be past methods of provisioning, to knowledge and experience of the poorer nations and marginalized communities, or the less growth-driven imaginings of thinkers and technicians and cultural workers wherever they're going to be found. And I've compared the forms of enlightenment and personal epiphany that kind of green revolution will demand to those required in the case of the other major historical movements for emancipation, such as feminism, or the campaigns against slavery and racism. And I think how that movement might unfold over coming decades is going to be critical to the experience of all future generations. And I'm going to end there on that note. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kate. Hear, hear. Wonderful, cogent presentation. Cara.
Shall I come out of the, is that better if I come out of the?
Should I stop sharing your
Does
slides?
it matter? I mean, does it get in the way of anything?
Yeah, let's sure. Why not?
All right, okay.
We can come back to them if we need to.
Yeah, okay.
So Cara, go ahead. Also, I just want to point out, Kate, there were a few questions and comments in the chat. So if you, if you can't read them, I'm happy to read them out loud. But Cara, go ahead. Why don't you start us off?
Yeah, thank you. Oh, wonderful presentation. Yeah. Well, that's very nice of you all.
Kate, should I jump in?
Hi.
Yes, hi, Kate, thank you so very much. I have a few illustrations of this alternative hedonism that I have been living with my family and in community for decades, and I'd like to share a few of them and ask your reflections because of the extraordinary challenges. One is my partner and I recently organized something in our community called Soul Space, Shared Opportunity Used Local, which is
Sure, use local.
Yeah. Soul.
Yeah, soul.
Shared Opportunity Used Local.
Okay.
Yeah. And it is essentially a free store. It's an example of the collaborative consumption, the connective consumption of which you spoke, where we are attempting an intersectional space to address consumerism, environmental racism. We're attempting a bioregional learning center in this space in our community. So I'll set up a few of the examples and then share some of the challenges. So Soul is one. Another is our fiber shed community. Are you familiar with fiber shed, or others familiar with the term fiber shed? Fiber shed. So local labor, local dyes, local production of fibers to address the textile tyrannies and fast fashion, that the world of that world of consumer culture. And the artisans, in terms of Juliet Shore's reference to artisanal productivity as non-alienating and not participating in factory modalities, and the extraordinary challenges that the artisans, the fiber artists here in this community have to endure because we are still operating in a capitalist framework. So that's the second. The third is that my family and I live in a converted school bus. We've lived in it for 7 years. It's an eco-art installation where we do climate justice performances. And the fourth are eco-villages, where my family and I have lived, as what I have experienced as, in many ways, glorified suburbias. So with these 4 examples, I'm curious about infrastructure and coevolution. There are these hedonistic fragments, I'll say, but without an investment in an attempt to address the indoctrination, as you mentioned, the dumbing down through education, compulsory education. I'm struggling terribly as a parent of a teenager, for example, and I'm curious to hear your perspective and others' perspectives when these commitments are in place in micro in our family, in very small communities, but we are constantly in the face. We're constantly straddling advanced capitalist indoctrination and tyrannies of normalcy, these interlocking hegemonies,
and all its systemic
something like soul space,
infrastructural ways of I mean, it's a huge problem. I mean, we're talking here about how do we actually create a very, very radical form of transformation, if you think about it.
yes.
And you know what we tend to do. I mean, what I've done in the talk, what your oops, sorry, lost you now. What you're citing are the ways in which people are increasingly trying to kind of, in the interstices of the growth-driven capitalist order, to create alternative ways of doing it. I mean, this for me has the sort of echo of the anarchist Proudhon, actually, who had a kind of idea is that you would sort of make so much intervention of that kind that eventually the larger structural forms of the dominant hegemonic order will begin to crumble. I mean, I think that's a little over optimistic myself, and we can't see that happening at the moment. I mean, there are people who are trying to work in this direction. I mean, there is now the body of theorists who are into what they call commoning, you know, who are trying to kind of think through, people like Massimo De Angelis, do you know?
I do not.
No, who's Ben and one as well, who have been trying to think through the ways in which we can begin to put forward alternative economic institutions and arrangements of a more, to replace capitalism by what they call a post-colonial and a post-growth commoning. But it does look pretty utopian, and I mean I don't have the answers to the problems you're raising. What I have tended to try to, what I feel is important is that we work on what I've called the cultural revolution, in trying to get as much support as possible built for an alternative way of thinking about prosperity, an alternative way of thinking about progress, an alternative way of thinking about the good life, and one that emphasizes, as part of the seduction of that actually this could also be better for you, you know, that you could enjoy a better life. So there's a kind of an appeal to self-interest as well as an appeal to doing the right thing for others. Because I don't see how we actually build a more sustainable economy without building up that kind of cultural support in the first instance. I mean, because I don't think we're looking at some violent form of breakdown and revolution. I mean, I think we're going to have to look at this as something that comes about through an electoral demand and creating some kind of mandate. And then we're sort of thinking of that as having to happen as well in many nations at one, you know, on a global scale. So it's a very big problem. However, we are talking about this now. I mean, if you think about the whole issue about growth, I mean, you were regarded as pretty nutty only 5 years ago if you started calling for a degrowth economy. But it's already becoming more mainstream. Many academics are working on it now. So a sort of progress gets made. How it then translates eventually, we have to see. You know, at the moment, the
Or
right
it's being
is anything
greenwashed.
in the sentencing, you know. Sorry, yeah.
I think degrowth, the adaptation is being greenwashed in many ways.
Mm.
And there isn't a fundamental shift in, for example, education in the United States, at least.
Mhm.
I think that's part of the precariousness of these discussions when there's a romanticization of, like, I think with Juliet Shore's comment, there's a certain tinge of romanticization that doesn't acknowledge the complexities of what it means to be in these interstices, but not just in, but being shredded, being torn apart by.
It's not sufficient recognition of the contradictions with which we have to deal in that. You're quite right about that. And I'm glad you say that, because I think too many of these, I mean, there is this kind of idea that, you know, there's a kind of notion of folk politics going on here, you know what I mean? So, which isn't properly recognizing how this just will not translate into the wider world, you know, in the way that we need it to, in order to be able to make that kind of difference eventually. So yeah, the tension is absolutely there. The contradictions are there, and we're going to have to live them. But I don't think it means we should give up, you know, seeking to make a difference through that kind of alternative lifestyle. But I fully appreciate what you're saying. Yeah.
No, I think, let me just jump in here. So Andy has a great and long question in the chat. And while you're reading it, I just wanted to respond very quickly to Kara. You know, about the challenges of parenting, which I fully appreciate. And my kids are quite a bit older than yours, but I remember fighting with them endlessly when they were younger about screen time, and, you know, fighting exactly as you're saying, you know, the infiltration of the system into the micro culture of your family. And one of the amazing moments, and of course this is just anecdotal, but one of the most amazing moments of this trajectory was our second kid, our daughter, wrote her college essay on how happy, her college application essay on how happy she was that she was raised without a television. And that, you know, was when we found out that that was her, you know, application essay topic, we were thrilled and also flabbergasted, because, you know, we were constantly fighting with them about screen time. And of course, it's true, we didn't have a television because we didn't want them to be exposed to the advertising mostly, etc. But of course, they watched everything they wanted on the computer, you know? So, but still, I feel like that fact that she grew up and looked back with her own subjectivity happily with that choice that we made, I felt super gratified, you know? She turns out to be kind of a very hippie type, you know. Two of my kids actually spent, you know, a year, more than a year, living out of a pickup truck, a used pickup truck that they each bought and refurbished, you know, very much a nomadic existence. So again, you know, this is just anecdotal, but I feel like on an individual level, sometimes there is hope that the values you try to inculcate actually do seep in, you know. Not always, of course, there's no guarantees. Michaela, we couldn't hear you.
I didn't intend to be heard, but yes, there's hope. Listen to that.
Well, I do, you know, it speaks to, I think, the challenge of, you know, imposing something and wanting, because you believe so strongly in something, to force it on your kids. And you just can't do it. I mean, you know, and often it backfires. So I do think that one of the quotients, one of the elements of the discussion is time, that things change, that they grow up, and hopefully they become themselves, part of which means they've internalized some of your values. All right, let me stop there because I don't want to go on and on. It's not a systemic comment, obviously. Andy, hopefully, Kate, did you get a chance to read Andy's?
I did indeed, yes. I
Okay,
don't
great.
have to answer. You're quite right. I mean, there is a way in which I think consumer society gratifies what I sometimes call amour propre. This is a reference to Rousseau's idea of amour de soi and amour propre, and there's a self-interest or the self-love which needs to provide the actual essentials of, shelter and food, but there's also amour propre, and this is distinctively human need for the appreciation of the other, so that which then leads to a certain sort of need for the admiration. And I mean, the question is, how do we gratify that where we're not looking to consumer goods and the status they provide through cars and material possessions of various kinds, the keeping up with the Joneses kind of way of living. I don't know. I mean, it's exercised me quite a bit. What would be the right thing? What would be the alternative avenues for people? I mean, in some ways, I think, there's a lot goes on in sport and recreation of various kinds. I've sometimes talked also about replacing our existing work-driven culture by something more ludic. I'm not saying we're going to play all the time, but it seems to me that there is a sort of enjoyment which is not so emulative and competitive, but still provides a certain kind of gratification that comes from intrinsically valued ways of spending time, some of which might indeed be playing chess or just idling or talking or walking and cycling and things of this kind. And I also think that in a way what consumer-driven gratification tends to do is to invite people to think that they're distinguishing themselves through fashion following, through the acquisition of yet another new article of some kind or another. But in fact, fashion following doesn't really allow you to be particularly eccentric in any kind of way. I mean, you follow a fashion by actually suppressing your own instinct to anything different. So it's a form of conformism, really. So I mean, one way we could begin to think about this would be to suggest that instead of that form of seeking status, we do it through the development of our own forms of eccentric provision. And I think making your own stuff, some more self-provision or recycling of things, the sharing of things, all these provide opportunities, I think, for forms of bricolage of quite sort of inventive kinds. I mean, so I think there are avenues for quite interesting ways of thinking about how to, as it were, distinguish ourselves without it being done in an unsustainable and eco-malign way. But it's an interesting question. No question about that. And I think one reasons we got consumer society is that was the line of least resistance to gratifying amour propre, as it were. We need to have the imagination to work out the other routes, the more sustainable routes, I think.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of typing something. So there was another important question from Michaela that's in the Q&A. So if you click on that, you can read that. And if you can't find it, I'm happy to read that too.
Where am I? I'm curious to hear how your question is answered.
No, not in the chat, but there's a separate
Oh, hang on.
down at the bottom Q&A. So Michaela put in a great question. Where is the radical communal will to legislate, that is to halt, right? To build, for instance, to halt built-in obsolescence of technologies, to legislate reuse of materials for all new buildings, to legislate earth berm, etc., heat cooling technologies and ancient technologies for water recycling, sinks, toilets, etc., etc. Indifference and inertia will not allow these, in fact, simple changes to happen.
I don't know. I mean, again, it seems to me to be something that comes from the development of a different cultural way of thinking about the good life and prosperity, and the development as part of that of a more citizenly role. You know, we need the emergence of a way of thinking about ourselves that doesn't reduce us to being consumers, but emphasizes the more citizenly aspects. But for so long now, we have been encouraged to focus on ourselves as individual consumers rather than as having that accountability to the larger society. And this is particularly true in the US and in the UK, I think, you know, that it's undermined that sense of our having a kind of society and a social responsibility for it. And I don't know how we can restore that. I mean, for a moment it looked that, I don't know whether this is true in the States so much, but in the UK for a moment during the pandemic, there was a sort of sense of people helping each other out, sort of a newfound accountability and even of the pleasure of actually developing a more Republican, I don't mean Republican in the American sense, but a Republican, you know, a sense of responsibility for the society as a whole. But I think that's eroded again now. Now we've all got back to business as usual again. I don't know, do you have any ideas? I mean, on this score?
Clara mentioned before that even in the environmental communities that she lived in, like the community that I live in, there are many, many, many people who consider themselves green activists, but they have absolutely zero, from my point of view, zero commitment to real change, how we build, how we use water, how we use our cars, other than for people to go buy you know, an e-car, an electric car. Other than that, they have very little commitment to really changing their lives. And I find it infuriating, because the only way I think we're going to make serious changes is to do it on every single local level across a region of a state, and then across the state, and then across northeast and southwest, southeast, southwest, the whole thing. Everybody has to do it from grassroots. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And that's how you influence your legislators, because the citizens are already doing it, and they want their legislators to speak for them. But we're not making the changes. I can't even get at the YMCA people to turn on and off the water while they're showering, while they're soaping up. I can't even get them to do that without somebody who's the head of a local NVEC here, Nittany Valley Association, saying, oh no, it's one of the few pleasures I have in life to have a hot shower. I haven't had a hot shower in decades because I don't leave the water on long enough. Excuse me for being angry, but there is no will. And that's the bottom line. Everybody has all of these great ideas, but nobody has the will to really invest their own lives in it and then make sure that their communities are committing. Sorry, I'm angry.
No, I sympathise. I mean, I have the same experiences here. I mean, I live in a small village actually, and there's a quite good bus service, but nobody uses it except me. And I go to parish council meetings, and everybody's complaining about how much car congestion there is on the road. And can we make the road safer? Well, yes, get out of your cars. Use the buses. But yeah, people don't. But I also agree with you that our politicians aren't going to do anything about it. The fossil fuel companies, it's quite clear from COP28, are going to do zilch about it. So I think the pressure does have to come, as you say, from the grassroots. It has to come bottom up. We have to force politicians to represent us at that level. But if we're not changing our ways, it becomes, a very difficult. I mean, I'm not optimistic. No. I mean, the alternative is going to be a form of barbarism in the longer term. So it is extremely worrying. I also agree with what Jonathan says as well. We need time. Whether we've got enough time, I don't know. But some changes have taken place. Obviously, none of us were talking about greening consumption 30 years ago, or very, very few. Do you see what I mean? So now everybody is, even if they're not really doing it. So, but
I appreciate your honesty.
Excuse me, 30 years ago, my husband and I built an earth berm home with anyway, an earth berm.
I'm not
toilet, et cetera. Actually, it was 40 years ago.
40, okay.
40 years ago.
Yeah, okay.
And it was a glorious. It was glorious.
Right. Yeah, but there were people, it's quite true. But now, I don't think there's a political party left or right which can't say something about the environment. That was not true, 40 years ago. In fact, hardly any political party talked about the environment at all. Now there's nowhere they can go to.
Rachel Carson died of cancer from pollutants, and she was writing in the 60s.
Yes, no, there was writing going on. Including by
everybody knew Rachel Carson.
I'm 80 now, and I'm back in the 60s. I had started writing, but I'm talking really about more the general public and the politicians in particular and the scientists. They were not. Now it's a much more mainstream concern. But I'm not denying that not enough is happening, and not enough people are making the changes needed. But somebody else wants to ask a question, and leave him.
Yeah, two more. We have two more questions here, Ellen, and then Alicia.
Right, Ellen.
Oh, hi. I'm sorry I missed the beginning. And so you may have spoken about this, but for me and the work that I do, everything that you're talking about this values and cultural change, feels like it's the work of religion to do that. And that's why I got into religion, is because I felt like change could happen there, that it could, I mean, it could have been very naive on my part, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are. Like, to me in academia, there's such a huge shift, a split and disinterest in the world of religion. And that seems to me, that's a huge problem. But I'm just curious as to, from where you stand, how you think of the possibility of religion in helping with a cultural shift.
Well, yes, it's a big question. Very briefly, I'm not a religious person, actually. I'm an atheist. However, I have actually quite a lot of, I do think there is a role here for religion. And one of the first things I did actually, when I was working on alternative hedonism, and we decided we would try to stage a conference which would bring together different religions, including Islamic and Buddhist, as well as mainstream Christian and Jewish and so on, to actually have a kind of conversation with those who didn't have any necessary religious commitment, precisely around the common ground they might have about the need to, in terms of their critique of the consumerist, materialist way of living.
Right.
So one of the odd things, I think, one of the things that religion does highlight, obviously, is the more spiritual needs of people, and the importance of those, and the ways in which they are not being, I think, properly met in our existing culture. I don't think you have to necessarily be a religious person to appreciate that. And I would count myself as a non-religious person who wants a more spiritual culture and society. So, and then part of the problem for me, I'll be honest here, has been that the notions of spirituality come very loaded, if you like, with the religious sort of connotation, so that if you wanted to, we just don't have the vocabulary outside of religion, I think, for some of these, for the moves that I would like to make in terms of a cultural transformation. So, I don't feel personally myself that I have to be a religious person in order to appreciate that, but I do appreciate people who are religious for actually understanding that dimension better than a lot of others. And I was very struck also by the Laudato Si document that the Pope put out, because this is way in advance in most of our politicians, for example. So there are, people within the church can make very important contributions, I think. And I actually did do I did do a talk about Laudato Si myself with some people at Penn State University, I think it was. So yes, I don't know if that really answers your question, but
No, for me, this is the work I've been doing my whole life, really, is working in the religious community around this, but it just seems like the obvious place to make these kind of cultural shifts. And it's problematic to me that there's not, there's so much, I understand it, that that academia and environmentalists have a hard time with the religious world, but there's like you have to look hard to find places where this work is happening, but it's really happening.
Point. I mean, I think we could do more. I mean, yeah, in ways of communicating with each other. Yeah, I don't deny that. So, Alicia, you have a question, I think. Is that right?
Well, not quite a question. I wanted to respond to Kara,
Yeah.
and and also to Michaela, because there's such a big level of frustration in trying to live the life that we're trying to live, and I get it completely. And how do we metabolize those emotions so that we can move to a different place? And it's, for me, it's not just a matter of consumption, but also the very important point of pleasure, of appreciation of beauty.
Mhm.
And how do we do that? Now, I'm also very interested in fiber. And we had a horrible situation here in our country a couple of years ago where immigrant children were being put in cages, and people were so angry. And I was like, how do I get my own community to metabolize that anger? And how can we use beauty to do that? And so I said, let's just make little blankies for kids. And I wanted to get everybody involved, not just the people who are angry at the president. And so I said, every child, if they're traveling, they need a blankie. So this is not a Democrat or Republican issue. This is a human issue. And every week I have a little weaving center, community weaving center called the Loom Room. And every week I would come in and there'd be a bunch of these little blankies hanging on the doorknob. And we sent them down to immigrant children. And so I to a group that was working with immigrant families. And they got distributed to the children. Now, I think the thing that I learned from that was that we need to create, you gave this image, Kate, of fulfillment centers. And I was like, what kind of fulfillment centers do we create ourselves? And I think repetitive action is, like in knitting or quilting or whatever, is one way of creating peace within ourselves. And so it's very important, and we have largely given up on that as a society. So I think we need to find ways to reach out, create fulfillment centers, and help people metabolize those frustrations into something positive. And so to me, this is really important, because I think we need to use beauty or creativity as a way to go beyond preaching to the choir, because we're just going to, or preaching to the non-choir and have the door shut, because I think that's just going to, both of those things are just going to get us frustrated. And so, anyway, I love the textile piece behind you, Kara. And I just want to contribute that as a way to help us move forward a little bit. It's not quite hedonism, but it is certainly in the same spirit of trying to use beauty to help us go somewhere.
Yeah, no, I endorse that completely. I mean, I think actually art and cultural work generally has got quite a contribution to make in giving us an alternative aesthetic of
Yes.
consumption, if you like, the end of the life, and to escaping, as it were, from the dominant kind of imagery of advertising, monopolizes the ideas of beauty and the good life. So it's art and cultural work and providing alternatives to that, which I think is very important.
Wonderful. Yeah, Kari, last word.
If I may bridge all of our comments, actually. Ellen, your comments about religious ideas, Alicia, beauty, all of our extraordinary passion. If we think, for example, in Judaism about the blessings, I'm forgetting the name, to go to the bathroom, for example, that kind of renewed respect for our bodies, and you're using the term metabolize, which I so love, Alicia. If we can invoke those kinds of blessings as a form of beauty, as a form of activism, where the activism isn't something separate from our bodies, it's not something separate from the mundane normalcies of how we function as organic beings. To me, that's where I get giddy, and where I feel, even in the midst of my son's sex ed class, the only thing that they're learning is to wear deodorant and to shower every day. It's so body phobic and, of course, ecocidal. But in that, if we could remember these kinds of spiritual commitments, like the Judaic practice of blessing our orifices, the flux, the movement of what comes in and goes out of our bodies in relation to the Earth's body. So I was excited about the bridges as potential.
Beautiful. Thank you. So, okay, Michaela, you get the final last.
One more comment. In the 50s and 60s, there was a very extraordinary movement. I have no idea if it's still going on now, called ethical culture. An ethical culture movement was a movement that was a spiritual movement. It was very similar to religions, but it was based on commitment to being to being our brother and sister's keeper, actually. And the ethical culture movement was an extraordinary movement that bridged those who believe in deities and those who do not. But they all had so much in common. And growing up in New York, in Westchester, across Long Island, there was a sense of commitment to one another that was beautiful, and it was a sense of community that allowed us to be activists together, even if we had different perspectives.
Well, I love what you said, and it segues wonderfully into my attempt to wrap up by connecting everything that has been said. So before I do, though, I want to remind people that there were a lot of great comments in the chat. So if you want to go save the chat, now is your time to do so, because once I close down, the session, then the chats disappear. Actually, ethical culture was founded in the 1890s. Felix Adler, good Jews started ethical culture, and their goal was to really keep the best, preserve the best of religion while jettisoning the superstition and the nonsense. And one of the things I have to say about what we try to do here with the Green Sabbath Project is kind of modeled by what happened here today. We have several rabbis, we have a Marxist speaker, we have some scholars, we have some activists, people living in intentional communities, crafting communities. And to me, among all of the vital things we have to do is we have to learn to talk to each other and listen to each other across differences. So I really, really appreciate, Kate, everything you presented today, and being able to learn with you, learn from you. And I do highly recommend that people take a look at her publications, which are which extend in depth and breadth what we heard today. And I look forward to keeping this going at such a high level every time. It's really very inspirational for me to have all of your different perspectives thrown into the mix, into the salad bowl. I have a lot of things I would love to say, but I won't, just because we've gone on for an hour and a half, which is, I think, a sign of how much there is to talk about. And I really love just how much overlap there is in you know, these different perspectives, and yet there's so much common ground, spiritual, non-spiritual, you know, political, sort of more cultural, spiritual, and yet we end up really, I think, repeatedly, which I don't think is a coincidence, repeatedly coming to a set of core topics or thoughts or fears or hopes, which I find interesting. So I bless you all with energy to keep thinking and keep working on all of this. And hopefully we will see you in a month. February 8th, I think, is when we will next gather online with Day Schildkret, a fascinating artist and activist, and I'll send out a reminder, as I always do, or always try to. And Kate, thank you once again. I just really...
Thank you.
No, well, thank you all as well. It's quite true. There has been a diversity of opinions here, but I think there's been common cause as well. So let's build on it.
Exactly. All right, everyone, be well.
Thank you. Bye.
No,
Ellen, nice to see you. Michaela, Alicia, everyone,
I know.
and David.